So by the time they are talking to a journalist like me, they have an opportunity to reflect. They understand they are in the final act of their life. And as many of them have said to me, I'm a grandfather now. And so this raises an interesting paradox, which I think you're hinting at, which is, what do people in the later stages of their life think about when they were younger men? And do they wonder if they would have done it differently? And that is a question I almost always ask. And in general, the answers, and I quote people directly, but the answers tend to be more subtle.
Hmm.
And I think they allow us to read between the lines, because you have people who are dedicated civil servants or military officers. And maybe this loops us back to that original question you asked me, like, do I have faith in the government? Do I have faith in democracy? American democracy. And that is why my answer is yes, because so many of the individuals I spoke to, even though they reflect and maybe there's a sense of I could have done it differently, what they are in essence saying by going on the record with me, and again, this is my interpretation, which is, take my story and learn from it.
Yeah, there definitely is. I think it's true for everybody. I mean, as you grow and have experience and your life changes. I mean, I remember being 20. I thought that 30 was as old as a human being gets. And I never thought about having children. And
Mhm.
now I'm into my late 40s and my oldest son is 21 going on 22. And I
Mhm.
remember what I thought about what military service would be like. I remember thinking about what direct exposure to combat would be like. And I often find the people that have been around a good amount of violence, they're changed by it most often, and they have no desire for exposure to that anymore, or for anybody else to be exposed to it.
Mhm.
And that was kind of the origin of that question about those directly responsible for these weapons, knowing what it could cause. It wouldn't surprise me at all as if later in life they had a shift or a different mentality and
Mhm.
firmly landed on a place where they would never want to see them used. Not that they wanted to see them used while they were in the steward of those, but and perhaps even maybe reducing the nuclear arsenal. Which, do you think that that's even possible? Do you think it's ever possible for us to get to a non-nuclear world?
Mhm. Okay, so I'm going to answer that question, but first I'm going to tell you one interesting coda to this, which is that I asked Richard Garwin. So Richard Garwin is that individual, the physicist who drew the plans for the Ivy Mike bomb,
Okay.
the first thermonuclear, and has advised every president since. I asked him if he regretted what he did. And after a long pause, he said to me, I wish it couldn't have been done.
Oh, interesting.
And what he was saying, I think about this often, is what he was saying is, if I hadn't done it, someone else would have. I mean, and that's really something to think about when you write about science and technology and war and weapons, as I do. And also, by the way, we know now that the Russians were on the path of designing a thermonuclear weapon and did just a few months after we did.
Hmm.
And so you have this real complex catch 22 about science and about technology. But there was a second part of your question which I wanted to answer, which was interesting. Do you remember what?
I was just wondering if you think it's ever possible, given where we are in 2025, to arrive at a non-nuclear world.
Oh, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. So, all right. So, another hopeful story. In the 80s, in the 80s, in 1986, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons. 70,000. Today, we have approximately 12,300.
All right, we're making improvements.
So how did we get there? How did we get there? Well, Ronald Reagan was a hawk. when he took office. He was working on Star Wars, the strategic defense initiative that put uh, weapons into space. But he watched a television movie called The Day After, which envisioned, it was an ABC TV movie, and it envisioned nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And he watched that movie, and his chief of staff, by the way, did not want him to watch it, but he did. And he wrote in his White House journal that he became greatly depressed.
Huh.
But as a result, he reached out to Gorbachev and he became willing to see the enemy. And keep in mind, in 1983, when that movie came out, the Soviet Union was the twirling mustache bad guy. They
Oh,
were really the arch enemy.
this is the Red Dawn movie era. They're
Yes.
invading. Yes.
I mean, and so the fact that Reagan could see see Gorbachev as the adversary, not the enemy. You want to kill the enemy, and you want to the adversary is different. You might work with them, and that's what he did. And that is why the world went from 70,000 nuclear weapons in 1986 to where we are today. And the two of them almost signed this treaty that made, that to essentially get rid of all nuclear weapons. It's called Global Zero in the sort of, disarmament world. Do I think we can get there? Well, what I do know is there's a treaty at the United Nations called the TPNW, the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons. And it's signed by a majority of the 193 nations of the UN, a majority of them, but not the nuclear armed nations who still want to keep their arsenals. But when you have a majority of nations, that's half the nations. It kind of goes back to that question we were discussing earlier, which is the people are speaking. They are saying we don't want these weapons. We don't want so many of them. If you read my book, you realize if nuclear war begins, it ends in annihilation. And so 70,000 nuclear weapons, my God, 12,300, we're doing better. Okay, if you look in an ideal world, global zero, certainly for the disarmament folks, but how about moving toward it?
Yeah.
And that seems very realistic and very practical to me. And again, politics having nothing to do with my reporting, I am certainly optimistic about the current president speaking about denuclearization, speaking about his previous conversations, which many of us didn't even know about, with China and Russia, about the possibility of reducing arsenals. That is a profound step in the right direction.
I agree. Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad that people like that and initiatives like that exist for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to lateral gears on here a little bit, but this falls directly into your reporting.
Mm-hmm.
I need you to tell me about all the aliens that are being held at Area 51.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're the one who knows. You have to tell me the
I
secret.
mean, I write in the end of Area 51, I discuss that deception campaign in the last 12 pages of my book. And people just went so berserk. It's part of why I think the book became such a bestseller, because I even had the alien people saying, that's too dark. And I'm not going to give it away. You have to go read Area 51. But my source in that book was a nuclear weapons engineer. And while he gave me permission to tell his whole story after he died, and I still haven't done that, I did discuss him and his work on the Lex Friedman podcast that I did when Nuclear War came out, because it's a very interesting thread, this mix of deception campaigns to prevent nuclear World War III and the actual development of thermonuclear weapons. And
Oh,
I don't mean to
interesting.
be cryptic, but at the same time,
No,
I
I can
hope
see the breadcrumbs on that.
yeah, and I also hope people will understand when you're me, like, I sometimes that individual, for example, his name was Al O'Donnell, and he was a member of the Manhattan Project. He wired the very first, nuclear bomb after the war. It was called, the Crossroads Test, and I write about it in Nuclear War, and I write about it in several of my books.